In July of 1980, Sarah Hall and her 5 children moved from their home in New Jersey to rural Oregon to escape the violent outbursts of her abusive husband, Robert. They settled into a small cabin in the peaceful Cascades town of Pinewood, hoping to finally find a safe and secure place to call home. For a time, it seemed like their fears were behind them. Then, on the morning of April 11, 1982, Sarah, her 14-year-old daughter Lisa, and her 5-year-old son Andy drove back from visiting a friend. They stopped at Hillside Park to pick up 10-year-old Ben and ran into 15-year-old Eric, who was hitchhiking home with his friend Dave. After lunch, Lisa made plans to stay overnight at the neighboring Benson family's house, while Sarah stayed at home with Ben, Andy, and the boy's young friend, Jason. Lisa left for the Bensons around 8 p.m., leaving her mother with the younger children. 12-year-old Tara Hall joined her sister for a short while, but returned home to sleep at around 9:30 p.m. That night would mark the last time the Hall family would be whole. A horrific and avoidable tragedy was about to change their lives forever. On the morning of April 12th, Lisa returned home from her sleepover to a scene she would never forget. She found the lifeless bodies of her mother, older brother Eric, and his friend Dave in the living room. They were bound with tape, and her mother had been gagged with a cloth. The attack on them had been shockingly brutal. 2 knives and a hammer, all stained with blood, were found at the scene, one knife bent at an angle from the force used. Evidence showed the murders happened in the living room, but the killer had arranged the victims' bodies in a gruesome display. Sarah was found near the couch, partially unclothed, with multiple stab wounds, including one that severed her voice box and nicked her spine. A mark on her head matched the butt of an air rifle, suggesting she had been struck to subdue her. Eric and Dave suffered severe head trauma from a claw hammer. Eric's throat was slashed, while bruises on Dave's neck indicated he had been strangled. Lisa went upstairs to check on her younger siblings and found Ben, Andy, and Jason unharmed in their bedroom. However, Tara was missing. Neither Lisa nor the Bensons had heard anything suspicious during the night, but a couple living nearby reported faint screams around 1:15 a.m. Tara's jacket, shoes, and a box of tools were missing, and the phone was left off the hook. The blinds were drawn, suggesting the perpetrator tried to hide their crime. Investigators suspected the victims likely knew the assailant. Early suspects included a local man who fled Pinewood shortly after the killings. Though later found in Washington, he passed a lie detector test and was ruled out. Another suspect emerged when a neighbor, Marilyn Kane, claimed she found a bloody jacket in her basement, which she turned over to police. Her husband, Tom, reported a missing hammer similar to the one used in the murders, raising suspicion. Despite this, he too was cleared. Meanwhile, young Jason provided inconsistent accounts of the night, once describing details he claimed to have dreamed. Under hypnosis, he recalled hearing noises in the living room and seeing Sarah with 2 unknown men before Eric and Dave intervened. Tara was then led out of the cabin and never seen again. Despite thousands of investigative hours, police found no clear motive. Speculation ranged from ritualistic killings to drug-related violence, but no evidence supported these theories. A family acquaintance mentioned that Eric and Dave had recently stolen drugs from local dealers, but this too lacked proof. For years, Tara's disappearance remained a focus, with the FBI briefly taking over the case. However, their efforts yielded no new leads. It wasn't until April 1985 that a bottle hunter discovered part of a human skull and jawbone near Cedar Falls, over 60 miles away. Additional items found nearby included a jacket, jeans, a blanket, and a surgical tape dispenser. Forensic testing confirmed the remains belonged to Tara. The case lay dormant until 2008, when Marilyn Kane alleged in a documentary that her husband Tom and his friend Bill Sanders were responsible. She claimed that on the night of the murders, She awoke around 2 a.m. to find them burning something in their wood stove. Marilyn also stated Tom had a deep hatred for Eric. However, Tom passed a polygraph test, and Bill, who reportedly had ties to organized crime, died in the late 1980s. In 2016, a hammer matching Tom's description of his missing tool was found in a pond. Authorities believed it was deliberately disposed of. The renewed investigation identified several suspects, including Tom. Marilyn further revealed that Tom had mailed her a letter after leaving Pinewood, cryptically stating, "I paid for your love with 4 lives." A counselor who worked with Tom later claimed he confessed to killing Sarah and Tara but denied harming the boys. In 2018, police announced that DNA from the crime scene tape matched a known suspect, reviving hope that justice might finally be served. The truth behind the Pinewood murders could lead to disturbing revelations, but for now, the case remains an open wound. It was supposed to be a simple, productive weekend. My husband, my business partner Greg, and I had rented a cabin deep in the woods to finish up plans for an important project. We had been working on this for months, and this trip was meant to wrap up the last details. The cabin was far from everything, quiet, and seemed like the perfect place to focus. The drive was long, and when we got there, the cabin looked older than I thought it would. The wood floors groaned with every step, and the windows were so small that the sunlight barely got in. It felt closed off, but it was private, and that's what we needed. We unpacked, settled in, and started working right away. The first day went fine. We sat at the big table with papers and laptops scattered everywhere, working until the light outside started to fade. Once it got dark, though, the cabin felt even smaller. The trees outside seemed to crowd in, their branches scratching against the windows when the wind picked up. It felt like the forest was trying to get inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something. At first, it sounded like the old wood shifting or the wind blowing, but after a while, the sounds became harder to explain. A faint scraping, then a heavy thump. I lay in bed, frozen, listening to every creak. My husband was asleep next to me, breathing deeply, unaware of anything. I kept telling myself it was just animals. We were in the middle of nowhere, after all. The next morning, Greg was already up when I came into the kitchen. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept much either. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. We both knew we had too much work to get through to talk about a bad night. By midday, Greg went outside to take a break while my husband and I stayed inside, working on the project. 20 minutes passed, then 30. When Greg still didn't come back, I started to get irritated. We had deadlines and he was wasting time. I told my husband I'd go check on him. Stepping outside, the cold air hit me right away. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no crunch of leaves, just dead silence. I called Greg's name and walked around the side of the cabin. That's when I saw his car. The door was open, but Greg wasn't there. His phone was lying on the ground next to the car. The screen shattered. My chest tightened as I looked around, but there was no sign of him anywhere. I ran back into the cabin, my heart racing, and told my husband. We grabbed flashlights and ran out into the woods, calling Greg's name. But the forest didn't answer. It was so silent that even our own voices sounded wrong. The hours dragged on, and before we knew it, the sun started going down. The dim light from my flashlight caught something in the dirt, a streak of red. My stomach flipped. I followed it a few steps, but it stopped suddenly, like whatever had caused it had been dragged away. That was it. No Greg, no answers. Just the sick feeling that something awful had happened. We went back to the cabin, locked every door and window, and tried to call for help. But there was no signal and the cabin didn't have a phone. My husband said we should leave, but the road was narrow and dangerous in the dark. We decided to wait until morning. Neither of us slept. Every little sound outside made me jump. The hours crawled by, and I kept looking at the windows, half expecting to see something looking back. When the sun finally came up, we didn't waste a second. We packed our things, got in the car, and left. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin. Felt different now, less like a place and more like a trap. Something about it was wrong, but I couldn't explain it. When we got back to town, we reported Greg missing. The police searched the area but found nothing. No signs of a fight, no tracks, no clues. Just Greg's car and his broken phone. Weeks turned into months, and eventually they stopped looking. The project fell apart without Greg, and so did everything else. My husband and I couldn't move on. Every night, I'd lie awake, replaying the weekend in my head, wondering if I had missed something. I kept seeing that red streak in the dirt and the empty woods around it. Sometimes, I think about how quiet the forest was that day. No birds, no insects, nothing. Like the woods were holding their breath, waiting. And now I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there that weekend, it wasn't done. My grandfather wasn't a man who shared much about his life. The scars on his hands and the way he carried himself told me he'd been through things I couldn't even picture. When he said we had something to take care of, I didn't ask why. I just got into the truck. The drive to the cabin was long and quiet. The old rifle in the back seat and the bag he threw in before we left told me this wasn't a normal trip. We went deeper into the woods than I'd ever been. The trees grew so thick they blocked out most of the sunlight, and the air felt heavy. I didn't see a single car or even a power line. We finally spotted the cabin as the sun started to set. It was small, with crooked walls, like it might collapse any second. But there was a light in the window. Someone was there. My grandfather parked the truck off the road, hiding it behind some trees. He pointed toward the cabin, and we got out. The woods were so quiet it made my ears ring. Every step I took sounded too loud, like the crunch of leaves and twigs might give us away. My grandfather handed me a flashlight but motioned not to use it. The moon gave enough light to see. When we got closer, I could tell the cabin wasn't as run down as it looked from a distance. The wood was sturdy, the windows clean. This place wasn't abandoned. Someone lived here. My grandfather crouched behind some bushes, pulling a pair of binoculars out of the bag. He watched for a while, then handed them to me. I saw a man inside, pacing back and forth. His shadow moved across the floor. I couldn't make out his face, but he seemed restless, maybe angry. On a table near him was a long knife, gleaming in the light. I didn't know who he was or why we were here, but something about the moment felt wrong. My grandfather signaled for us to move. We walked in a wide circle, staying out of sight, until we reached the back of the cabin. The ground was uneven, and I struggled to step quietly. Every little noise I made felt like it echoed in the silence. At the back door, my grandfather motioned for me to stop. He moved toward the door, his step steady. He grabbed the handle and turned it slowly. It opened without a sound. He slipped inside and left me waiting in the shadows. I stood there, my chest tight, counting the seconds. 5, 10, 15. Then I heard a soft thump from inside, followed by nothing. My stomach twisted, but I didn't move. I stayed where I was like he told me to. After what felt like forever, the door opened again. My grandfather stepped out, his hands empty, his face calm. He walked past me without saying anything, heading back toward the truck. I followed, looking back at the cabin one last time. The light in the window was still on, but the shadow inside wasn't moving anymore. We drove back in silence. The trees seemed even darker now, closing in on us as the truck rumbled down the dirt road. I wanted to ask what had happened, who that man was, but the words wouldn't come out. I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answers. When we got home, my grandfather told me to head inside while he stayed behind with the truck. I went to my room, but I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I'd seen, or rather what I hadn't seen. The next morning, the truck was spotless, and the bag was gone. My grandfather was sitting on the porch, drinking his coffee, like it was any other day. I looked at him, trying to read his face, but it was blank. Whatever had happened at that cabin, it wasn't the first time for him. It was just part of something bigger, something I wasn't meant to know about. Years later, I still think about that night whenever I see a cabin deep in the woods. I picture the man pacing inside, the knife on the table, and the silence that followed. But there's one thing I can't shake. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear it. That soft thump from inside the cabin, like it's still happening. Or maybe it's something else, something out there, waiting in the woods, watching. I rented a small cabin deep in the woods for the weekend. I wanted to get away from everything: work, noise, and all the stress piling up in my life. The cabin was old but solid, with a stone fireplace, wooden floors, and a small bedroom with old, creaky furniture. It had been raining since morning, but by the time night came, the rain turned into a full-blown storm. At first, I didn't mind the rain. The sound of it hitting the roof was calming, and sitting by the fire with a book felt cozy. But as the hours went by, the storm started to feel different, like it wasn't just a normal storm. The wind howled like something alive, shaking the windows. Lightning lit up the woods outside every few minutes, showing the tall, dark trees swaying violently. It almost looked like they were leaning toward the cabin. Around midnight, I heard a loud thud against the side of the cabin. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It was something heavy hitting the wall. I froze and listened. For a while, there was nothing but the sound of the storm, but then it happened again. Another thud, louder this time, like it was closer. I tried to tell myself it was just a branch blown by the wind, but my gut told me it wasn't. I locked the front door and went around checking all the windows, making sure they were shut tight. I peeked outside, but I couldn't see anything except rain running down the glass. I decided to stay in the living room by the fire. I turned off all the lights, thinking it might make it harder for anyone, or anything, outside to see me. The room felt colder now, even though the fire was still burning. My breathing sounded loud in the quiet moments between the wind gusts. Then I heard it again, this time on the roof, a heavy thud. My chest tightened as I realized something was up there. I grabbed the only thing I could find to protect myself, a metal poker from the fireplace, and slowly walked toward the front door. I didn't have a plan, but just sitting there, waiting, felt worse. As I stood there, I heard a new sound, a slow, scraping noise, like nails or claws dragging across the wood. It started on the roof and moved down the side of the cabin. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I held the poker so tightly my hands hurt, but I didn't dare move. The scraping stopped at the window. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. I couldn't see anything outside, just the rain and the faint reflection of the firelight. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something. I was letting my imagination run wild. I went back to the couch, keeping the poker close, and lay down. I stayed awake as long as I could, but at some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, everything was quiet. The storm had stopped, and the cabin felt eerily still. The silence was almost worse than the noise of the storm. I looked at the clock. It was just after dawn. I decided to step outside and look around now that it was light. Maybe seeing the area in daylight would calm my nerves. But when I opened the door, I froze. The ground around the cabin was covered in large, muddy footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. The prints circled the cabin over and over, like someone had been walking around all night, watching. The footprints didn't just stop there, though. I noticed something else, something that made my stomach drop. A second set of prints was leading away from the cabin, heading straight back into the woods. They weren't mine. I moved into the cabin a year ago, wanting to leave behind the noise and stress of the city. It was a small place, but it was enough for me and my baby girl, Mia. The woods around us were quiet and thick with trees, a perfect place to start over. I felt like I'd finally found some peace. That first winter was tough. I quickly learned how important firewood was. I spent hours cutting wood every week to keep us warm during the freezing nights. While I worked, Mia usually napped in her crib. I kept a baby monitor with me so I'd know if she woke up. One cold afternoon, I went out to cut more wood. I bundled Mia up and laid her in her crib, making sure she was safe and warm. The woodpile wasn't far from the cabin, just a few steps into the trees. I liked the work, it was tiring, but the sound of the axe splitting logs and the smell of fresh wood felt good. After about an hour, I heard a faint cry through the monitor. I froze mid-swing, my chest tightening. Mia didn't cry often, and when she did, it was usually soft and short. This was different. It sounded sharp, almost scared. I dropped the axe and ran back to the cabin, gripping the monitor tightly. Her cries grew louder as I got closer, but when I threw the door open, the sound stopped. Everything was silent. The crib was empty. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. My eyes darted around the room, looking for her. The blankets in the crib were pushed to one side, but Mia wasn't there. The door was locked. The windows were shut. I couldn't make sense of it. I ran outside, shouting her name even though she couldn't answer. The woods suddenly felt strange, heavier, like they were pressing in on me. My boots crunched in the snow as I searched, calling for her. But there was nothing, no sound, just the cold wind blowing through the trees. I felt panic rise in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. I dropped to my knees, my breath freezing in the air, and that's when I saw them. Tracks in the snow. They weren't mine, and they weren't from any animal. They were boot prints, big ones, and they led away from the cabin. I stood up, my legs shaking, and followed them. The prints were fresh, and whoever made them was moving fast. They cut through the trees, over uneven ground, twisting deeper into the forest. I tripped more than once, the cold stinging my face, but I didn't stop. The tracks led to an old hunting cabin I'd never seen before. It looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and a crooked door. But I could hear something inside, soft cries, muffled but clear. I pushed the door open hard, the wood cracking under my weight. The smell of mold and dampness hit me. Inside, the place was dark and filthy, but in the corner, on a dirty old mattress, was Mia. I ran to her, my heart pounding. She was cold and shivering, but she wasn't hurt. I grabbed her and held her close, her little body trembling against mine. I didn't look around. I didn't try to figure out who had brought her here. I just ran. Back at the cabin, I locked the door and shoved the table and chairs against it. I sat by the fire with Mia in my arms, my mind racing. How had they gotten in without breaking the door or windows? Why had they taken her? And why leave her somewhere I could find her? The snow fell all night, and by morning the boot prints were gone, erased like they'd never been there. I called the sheriff's station, but they didn't have much to say. They promised to send someone to check things out, but no one ever showed up. Since then, I've reinforced every door and window. I don't let Mia out of my sight, I've stopped going far from the cabin, even for wood. But no matter what I do, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching us. Sometimes at night, I hear faint footsteps outside. When I check, there's nothing there, just the empty woods. A few days ago, I found a baby blanket lying on the porch. It wasn't Mia's. Whoever was out there, they're not finished. They wanted me to know they can come back anytime. And the scariest part? They don't even have to break in to get to us. I'd always liked the quiet of my cabin near the border, but it wasn't without its problems. At 75, I wasn't as strong as I once was, but my years as a sergeant in the military had taught me how to deal with tough situations. Living this close to the border meant I had to be alert all the time, especially at night. The woods didn't just hide animals. Sometimes it hid people who didn't belong here. That evening, the air was cold, and the sun sank behind the trees, making long shadows stretch across the ground. I sat on the porch, holding my coffee, when I noticed movement along the tree line. At first, I thought it was just a deer, but then I saw it wasn't moving like one. It was too careful, too quiet. I set my cup down and picked up my binoculars. Through the lenses, I saw a man, middle-aged, dirty, and carrying a backpack. He was creeping toward the cabin, keeping low like he didn't want to be seen. My heart skipped a beat. Over the years, I'd seen all sorts of people, hikers, hunters, even lost travelers. But this felt different. This man wasn't lost. He was up to something. I stood up and made sure the rifle by the door was loaded before stepping back inside, locking the door behind me. I peered out the window, watching him come closer. He stopped about 50 feet away, looking around like he was making sure no one was watching. He didn't seem lost. He looked like he had a plan. The sky was getting darker, and the trees swallowed the light. I crouched low behind the curtain, watching him from the crack. He walked around the cabin, stopping at the windows and the door. Then he went to the back of the house, reaching into his bag. My stomach turned. Was he armed? Was he desperate, looking for a place to hide? I couldn't take any chances. Then I heard it, a soft clicking sound. I knew what it was right away, a lockpick. He was trying to break into the back door. My fingers tightened around the rifle as I moved silently toward the kitchen, making sure I didn't make a sound. I stood by the door, listening. The clicking stopped, and I heard the door creak as he tried to push it open. I wasn't ready to kill anyone, but I wasn't about to let someone hurt me either. I stood still, waiting. The man stepped inside, his shadow sharp against the moonlight. His movements were slow, careful. He froze when he heard the click of the rifle's safety. I could tell he was trying to figure out what to do. Without saying a word, I flipped the safety off. The man's eyes widened, and he quickly backed away, stumbling as he turned and ran out the door into the night. I locked the door again, my heart racing. But that wasn't the end of it. For the next few hours, I stayed near the window, my rifle ready. I could hear him outside, moving around the cabin. Twigs snapped under his feet. Leaves crunched as he circled the cabin. He was waiting for an opening. Each time I heard a sound, I'd look outside with the binoculars, but he was always just out of sight. It wasn't until late into the night that I saw him again, standing at the edge of the forest. This time he wasn't alone. There were two others with him, all carrying backpacks. My heart froze. I wasn't dealing with a lost traveler anymore. I was dealing with a group, likely smugglers or worse. It hit me then, these people weren't going to leave. They were going to try again. I knew I couldn't take the risk. Quietly, I slipped out of the cabin through a side window. I moved low, staying in the shadows as I made my way to the old trail that led to the ranger station about 2 miles away. I knew the area better than they did, so I kept to the back trails, moving fast but quiet, keeping the rifle in hand. When I reached the ranger station, I found it empty. The ranger must have been on patrol. I used the emergency radio to call for backup, describing what was going on and my location. Help came quickly. Less than an hour later, law enforcement arrived at the cabin. They caught the men trying to break in again. The officers told me the group had been smuggling things across the border for a while. They'd likely been watching my cabin for weeks, thinking I'd be an easy target. I couldn't sleep that night, not even after they were gone. I kept thinking about how close they'd come, how one wrong move could have ended with me in a ditch somewhere. The cabin never felt the same after that. It wasn't a home anymore, it was a warning. A reminder that safety is never as solid as you think it is. I stayed alert, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were still watching, waiting for me to slip up. Weeks passed, and things seemed to go back to normal. But I knew better. The silence was too quiet, the shadows too still. And sometimes, late at night, I'd hear a twig snap or the rustling of leaves from deep in the forest. I'd look out the window, but all I saw were trees, the same as always. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I'd been watched before. What stopped them from coming back? It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just me, a small cabin in the woods, and a break from everything. I'd been working nonstop on my medical research, so I needed to get away from the noise and stress of the city. The cabin was tucked away, far from any road, surrounded by tall trees. All I could hear was the wind blowing through the leaves. It seemed perfect for what I needed, time to myself. But the second night, things started to feel off. I had just finished some research and was about to head to bed when I saw something strange on the wall. At first, it looked like a small shadow, nothing to worry about. But when I got closer, I saw it clearly. It was an insect, a dark, spiny bug, about the size of a quarter. Its body seemed to blend right into the wall, almost like it was part of it. It didn't move, but there was something in the air, like it was watching me, waiting. I figured it was just a regular bug, maybe a beetle or something harmless. But then I remembered something I'd read about while doing research for work. There's a type of tick in this area called the woodland tick. It's known to be dangerous, can bite you and make you really sick, even if you don't notice it at first. Some of these ticks can carry diseases like Lyme disease, and that's what scared me. I remembered reading that they weren't that common, but still, this bug didn't seem right. I tried to grab it with a tissue, but it was quick, too quick. It shot across the wall and disappeared into a crack in the wood. My heart started racing. There was no way I was imagining it. The thing looked like it had a dark, greasy shine, and I was sure it was dangerous. I spent the next few hours searching the whole cabin. I had my flashlight, scanning every corner, every inch of the walls, but I didn't find anything else. I kept telling myself it was just my nerves, that I was overreacting. I had been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe I was just tired, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I barely slept. Every noise in the cabin sounded like something was moving around, maybe more insects. Every little creak and crack made me jump. I just wanted to leave. In the morning, I packed my things quickly. The sooner I was out of there, the better. But as I gathered my stuff, I felt something on the back of my neck. It was like a sharp pinch, an annoying itch. I scratched it, but when I looked at my finger, there was something dark on it. It was a tick, small, buried deep in my skin. My heart sank. I had no idea how long it had been there, but I knew I needed to act fast. I remembered everything I had read about ticks. The longer they stay, the more dangerous they become. They can carry serious diseases, and I couldn't risk that. I grabbed a pair of tweezers and, hands shaking, pulled the tick out. I put it in a small container, planning to look it up later. My pulse was racing, but I tried to stay calm. I cleaned the bite, packed everything quickly, and got into my car. I needed to go to a clinic right away. The drive was long, and the ticking of the clock in my car felt deafening. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something moving behind me, but there was nothing. I finally made it to the clinic. The place was small and quiet, but they said they'd test the tick and run some blood tests. They'd know soon if I was in trouble. A few hours later, the doctor came in. I wasn't sure what I expected to hear, but the words I got weren't good. No Lyme disease, but they couldn't be sure about everything. They said it was a rare type of tick, but it could still have carried something. I couldn't help but feel like I had dodged a bullet. I'd gotten lucky this time, but as I thought about it more, the weight of what had happened hit me. The tick might have been small, but it carried a potential that could have wrecked my life, could have left me sick for months. I wasn't even sure if it was the same type of tick I had read about, but at that point I didn't care. I just wanted it all to be over. When I look back at that trip, I can't help but feel uneasy. The woods seemed so peaceful when I first arrived, but there's something about nature that's unpredictable, something that feels too quiet, too still. It's easy to think that nothing can go wrong when everything is calm. But what I learned is that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in the most unexpected places, like a tiny, silent creature on a cabin wall. I thought I was safe, but maybe that was the biggest mistake I could have made, because the next time I might not be so lucky, and that thought still sends a chill down my spine.